well reach levels which have not been seen at least for the past 55 million years by the year 2100. That's 150% increase in ocean's acidity, concentration of protons. And this is, you will not find someone denying the fact that the oceans are acidified, because it can be measured, and there are several sites in the world where pH is measured, and all those sites indicate a decline of ocean pH as a function of time, even though those time series are relatively short. So for the chemistry, I mean, there is a very high degree of confidence about the chemistry that ocean acidification is happening, and it will continue to do so as CO2 emissions continue or increase. The changes to organisms and ecosystems. As I said, a young field of research. The first experiments were performed really in the early 1990s. Most calcifying species seem to be negatively affected by ocean acidification. The reason is, one of the reasons is that the concentration of carbonate, which is one of the building blocks of the skeleton and shell of calcifying organisms, is getting depleted, and its concentration is becoming limited. We also see changes in the diversity of pelagic and benthic systems when ocean acidity is high, impacts on the food chain and ecosystems, biodiversity loss, which is observed mostly near CO2 vents at pH levels expected for 2100, and also possibly changes in biogas production and feedback to climate. The point is that those biological and ecological effects, we have, for some of them, a high degree of confidence, but for some, a medium degree of confidence, especially with respect to food webs, for example, which is a key question. The level of confidence is quite low on the impacts. Also, for the biogeochemistry, the confidence levels are medium to low. And we have many knowledge gaps, unfortunately. One of them is, as Ansoto indicated, we have information on mostly one driver at a time, and it's very important to be able to estimate, to give projections, taking into consideration several drivers, at least the three major drivers that Ansoto advised in this presentation. We know very little about evolutionary adaptation, that is the way organisms can adapt to those new environmental parameters. This has happened in the past during geological times. Organisms have been able to adapt, but the changes were very slow compared to what happens today. So biological adaptation is really a key issue to make useful and realistic projections. Most of the experiments have been performed at the level of organisms, and which is fine in the lab, but what we want to know is what happens in the field with natural communities when you take into account interactions between species. And as I said, food webs, the effect of food webs is poorly constrained. Socioeconomic impacts, we are getting down or low in terms of the confidence levels. We know that there are some effects already today in the aquaculture industry, especially the aquaculture of oysters in the west coast of the US. An impact, potential impact on coastal protection. Reefs, for example, if they are affected by bleaching and ocean acidification, do not function as a key barrier to the destruction of waves and cyclones. Tourism, climate regulation, and carbon storage. Someone mentioned mangroves earlier on. That's a key carbon storage also. But again, medium to low confidence levels. I forgot to say here at the bottom you have the chapters, the relevant chapters of the IPCC Working Group 2 report, in which you can find more information on those things. So, what are the policy options for action? One is, of course, the UNFCCC, the IPCC work, the Rio +20, the Convention on Biological Diversity, is also involved. Geoengineering, this is the place to be for geoengineering this week. And also regional regulations and laws which may limit some of other stressors. Local stressors can be decreased in order to increase resilience to global stressors such as warming and acidification. And I'd like to use this graph of Ken Caldera, who is here this week. I saw it this morning. This graph, which I call the dented wheel, really explains what's happening. The desire that we have for improving our well-being makes us consuming goods and services in an increasing amount. So we consume energy, release CO2 into the atmosphere, which leads to climate change, impacts humans and society and ecosystems, which is negatively affecting our initial desire to improve our well-being. So this is really counterproductive. And what we can do about it is indicated here: conserving goods and services, increasing the efficiency of the industry to manufacture those goods and services and consume less energy, have clean energies that release less CO2 emissions. And this is where I think most of the action should take place, because that's where this graph here from working group 1, the working group 1 of the IPCC really shows what the difference it makes when you look at RCP 2.5 or RCP 8.5 in terms of pH. The projected pH can be stabilized in the future if we decrease CO2 emissions, and it will continue to decline if emissions continue to levels, as I said before, which have not been encountered by the oceans for the past 55 million years. It's really a dramatic decline. The other options here is, of course, CO2 removal, one of the geoengineering approach. That makes a difference, of course, because less CO2 we have in the atmosphere, less CO2 goes into the ocean, and less problematic ocean acidification becomes. However, solar geoengineering has almost no effect whatsoever on ocean acidification. It's very important to realize that because the purpose of this technique is really to release CO2 without increasing temperature. But the CO2 that is in the atmosphere, mechanically, 25% of it goes into the ocean. So this is really, from the perspective of ocean acidification, that is not a technique that is very appealing, quite the opposite. Then adaptation, Ansoto said that for many processes and organisms and ecosystems, adaptation, the scope for adaptation is limited. There is interestingly already adaptation taking place. I mentioned the oyster industry in the US. Already this industry has adapted by monitoring pH, which goes into its tanks where production of oysters is taking place. So they are monitoring pH and closing down the pumps in their facility and functioning as a closed system for a while. And another adaptation took place also. One of the producers of larvae of oysters relocalized its facility from the coast of Oregon to Hawaii, where ocean acidification is less of a problem. So finally, if we look at all those approaches to limit ocean acidification on a plot which shows the potential for limiting ocean acidification and the feasibility, the best option is really to reduce CO2 emissions or to remove atmospheric CO2 once it's in the atmosphere. And the less desirable is solar radiation management, which has very little potential to ameliorate the situation for ocean acidification. To conclude, Dorothy asked me to address also what we are doing as a scientific community to interact with the general public and policymakers. I would like to mention this Ocean Acidification International Reference User Group, which brings together scientists, policymakers, and representatives from the industry. It complements the work of the OAICC, established at the IAEA Donamo, and advises on the types of products that we need to get out hopefully with impacts. And several guides were produced. One of them is outside. And preparing for the Paris conference, this reference user group is working on different products to help make the ocean more prominent in those negotiations. And several products were, as I said, published and made available to different arena. And Carol Turley, one of the prominent ocean acidification scientists, attended all the last 4 COP meetings, and we are getting ready for the Paris meeting in 2015. Thank you very much.
Now we'll be transitioning to a panel of 3 eminent international experts in laws relating to the environment and climate change. I think we've heard the bad news about how dire the situation is in the ocean and how quickly these impacts are approaching. For those of us who look at international environmental law as a tool, or international law in general, at least we have some hope of trying to stimulate national, international, and regional cooperation through these efforts. My pleasure to introduce Professor Karen Scott, who is Professor in Law, School of Law, University of Canterbury, New Zealand. Professor Scott teaches, researches, and publishes widely in areas of public international law, international environmental law, the law of the sea, and Antarctic law and policy. Her current research projects comprise, amongst others, the fragmentation of international environmental law. We are looking forward to hearing her views on regime fragmentation between the oceans and climate change and opportunities to fill possible legal and policy gaps.
Well, thank you very much, Christina. It's a very great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the panel organisers for including me on this very interesting panel. The organisers asked me to talk a little bit about the relationship between climate change, and in particular the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. As the title of the panel indicates, you've clearly got relationship between sort of both atmosphere and oceans. So that automatically means for international lawyers that we've got multiple regimes and to an extent a fragmentation of regimes involved in the management of many climate change issues. So our 2 scientists this evening introduced wonderfully the unholy trinity of impacts of climate change on the ocean, acidification, warming and sea level rise. And clearly to the extent that those impacts have implications for the health of the environment, the health of natural resources, that engages the environmental obligations under both marine treaties and indeed potentially other treaties. But it's also worth noting that the impacts of particularly warming and sea level rise also have implications for access to resources. So for example, if fish stocks move, I think it was suggested in relation to temperature rises, then that may well have implications for the application of regional fisheries management organisations and indeed access by coastal states. And that's very much an issue which is of interest to law of the sea scholars. Similarly, in relation to sea level rise, one of the more crude consequences of sea level rise is of course coastal inundation and the submergal of what we describe as base points, and that has implications for maritime delimitation and the extent of maritime zones. So whilst clearly environmental issues dominate the interests of law of the sea scholars, it's by no means confined to that. There's actually a whole range of political and resource and territorial issues which are potentially impacted by climate change. Equally, there are potential sort of opportunities, or at least other issues which are raised by climate change, which arguably deserve a specialist or a particular regulatory response. In terms of geoengineering, which of course we've been discussing extensively over the last couple of days, ocean fertilisation has come up quite regularly. And we talk about the idea of sort of oceans as saviour, and I must admit I've stolen that phrase from my colleague Rosemary Rayfuse, who first used it a couple of years ago at a conference in Wollongong. But essentially exploiting the oceans and new uses of the oceans, whether that's the water column in terms of fertilisation, or indeed the seabed in relation to ocean sequestration, clearly require us to engage in different or potentially new rules, or at least the application of existing rules to new issues. In terms of opportunities, the last speaker talked a little bit about sort of the opening up of the sea ice in the Arctic, and of course there's a lot of interest in that area in relation to shipping. Well, that similarly has sort of implications, particularly for the regulation of shipping. And indeed, there's initiatives going on at the moment in terms of developing rules to regulate shipping rather more tightly than polar code. And similarly, also an Arctic-related opportunity in relation to potential new resources. So again, with the loss of ice, that may well make it easier to access other resources such as oil and gas. And I guess if we're thinking very much long-term, then potentially the Antarctic. But of course, what all this means is that these are sort of new issues which Law of the Sea scholars need to engage in, either to develop new rules or at least to apply existing rules to those issues. So in terms of the essential regime, the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is really the central instrument which governs all activities taking place in the oceans. It's a remarkable instrument, intended to be comprehensive, took 9 years to negotiate, 12 to enter into force, and is often described as being a constitution for the oceans. So it establishes really those concepts and principles which apply across the board to all oceans activities. It's also a framework convention, so it's by no means complete, and it very much relies on additional instruments, formally or informally, to plug the gaps, to provide more detailed standards. And it's actually with these other instruments that there's been the greatest response to climate change issues, because these are often more able to respond quickly and to develop into new areas. And I've just given a very few examples there, that's by no means an exhaustive list. But you've got the various shipping and marine pollution conventions under the auspices of the International Maritime Organization, multiple regional fisheries management organizations, regional seas conventions, and then instruments which relate to biodiversity, so such as the Biodiversity Convention, the Migratory Species Convention, and there's actually a whole number I could mention there. And in addition to that, we have sort of multiple, what we describe as sort of soft law initiatives, or more sort of a looser or more general options relating to issues such as coral reefs or land-based pollution. So there's actually quite a complex system of rules which sort of interact to support ocean management. So in terms of thinking sort of about regulating, and particularly regulating oceans issues, it's quite useful, I think, to think about sort of the locus of regulations and where we might attempt to address some of these issues which arise from climate change. And we've actually got a range of options there. So some are quite clearly regulated by UNCLOS itself. If not at the moment, then at least the locus for future regulation lies very much within that convention. A much greater number of issues are regulated by UNCLOS in addition to other agreements. And I'm using the term sort of affiliated agreement in a fairly loose term, so apologies to the lawyers there. I'm not suggesting there's necessarily a formal affiliation, but essentially instruments which support UNCLOS. There are then issues which are actually then regulated outside of UNCLOS, so actually are quite unconnected with UNCLOS. And then finally there are those which are not regulated. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to give you sort of 1 or 2 examples of each of those, just to sort of demonstrate the connections or the lack of connections, before concluding with one suggestion for going forward in terms of sort of developing or improving oceans governance in the context of climate change. So the first example of an issue which is regulated by UNCLOS, or at least will be regulated by UNCLOS, is that relating to sea level rise and its impact on baselines, maritime zones and maritime boundaries. So it's the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that essentially set out the rules in relation as to where you can establish your maritime zones, and it's those rules which will apply with respect, or at least in response to sea level rise. Now what we don't know at the moment is exactly what those rules are. There is a dispute as to whether you are able to fix your boundaries at some point, in which case they remain in place even as sea level rises, or whether they are ambulatory, essentially, whether they move according to the geography of the coastline. It's actually the latter interpretation which is more consistent with UNCLOS, but of course the risk of that